These emotions are violence is one of them,
right,
and sex is another. These are two emotions which are most easy to provoke in a human being. वो directors जो creatively इतने, if they are not so talented in in creating a story, in showing emotions, in creating situations, they depend heavily on violence and sex to make their films work.
In the rich landscape of Indian cinema, violence has always been a controversial and evolving element. From the subdued and suggestive skirmishness of classic films to the explicit and stylized brutality of modern blockbusters, the portrayal of violence has now transformed dramatically. But first, let us understand the distinction between action films and violent films, because both these genres offer different experiences through their unique focuses and themes. Action films like Dhoom, War, and not so good franchises like Baghi and Commando grip audiences with thrilling sequences of daring stunts, high speed chases, and intense battles. These films revolve around heroic characters facing clear cut conflicts between good and evil, exploring themes of bravery, justice, and survival. They provide an adrenaline rush and a sense of triumph, leaving viewers exhilarated by the hero's journey and spectacular feats. In contrast, violent films like Gangs of Wasipur and NH10 delve into the raw, unfiltered depiction of brutality and conflict. These movies explore the psychological and moral impacts of violence, presenting complex, flawed characters and themes of revenge, corruption, and the consequences of violent actions. They confront audiences with graphic and intense portrayal of violence, aiming to provoke thought and evoke strong emotions and responses. The violence serves as a powerful narrative tool, developing characters and conveying deeper philosophical messages about the human condition, societal breakdown, and the cyclical nature of violence. While action films entertain with their spectacular feats, violent films challenge viewers to reflect on the darker aspects of life and society. Now, violent films are less common than action films because of how they cater to a niche audience. The graphic content and complex themes in violent films can restrict their audience and commercial success, making studios favor the more commercially viable, universally appealing spectacle of action films over the provocative, unsettling narratives of violent films. Now, violence in movies manifests in different forms, and each paints the narrative with intense emotion. Imagine the raw intensity of hand to hand combat and the visceral clash of weapons, contrasted with the chilling subtlety of psychological torment and coercion. Sexual violence and harassment starkly reveal brutal realities. Stylized action sequences dazzle with the choreographed precision, and the graphic gore and body horror pack shock with unsettling detail, which is on the other end of the spectrum. Realistic depictions and war and crime dramas mirror societal issues, making the audience feel the weight of every blow. Whether evoking fear, excitement, or contemplation, the portrayal of violence in cinema remains a powerful visual storytelling tool. Each form often intertwines, which further enhances the narrative for the audience to understand the depth of what is happening in the story. In the early days of Indian cinema, violence was often implied rather than explicitly shown. Films like Mother India, Mughal-e-Azam presented violence suggestively using dramatic music, sharp camera angles, and expressive acting to convey intensity without graphic detail. Characters brandished weapons and engaged in combat, but the actual acts of violence were either off screen or depicted through suggestive imagery and sound effects. This approach was partly due to societal norms, censorship laws, and the general preference for family friendly entertainment. The 1970s marked a turning point with the advent of the angry young man era, epitomized by Amitabh Bachchan in films like Zanjeer and Diwar. These films introduced a more direct portrayal of violence, reflecting societal unrest and the audience's desire for a cathartic outlet. While not excessively graphic, the violence in these films was more visceral and impactful, resonating with the frustrations of the common man. The 1990s brought a shift towards more realistic depiction of violence, influenced by global cinematic trends and changing audience expectations. Films like Satya and Vastav showcase the gritty underbelly of an urban India with unflinching honesty. Directors like Ram Gopal Verma and Mahesh Manjrekar broke away from the glamorized violence, presenting it in a raw and unpolished manner. This period also saw the rise of the gangster genre, where violence was a central theme, depicted with the starkness that was both shocking and compelling. Coming to the 2000s, we have seen further evolution in the portrayal of violence. driven by advancements in technology, changing censorship norms, and a more liberal audience. Filmmakers began to experiment with stylistic violence, drawing inspiration from international cinema. Anurag Kashyap's Gangs of Wasipur is a prime example where violence is choreographed with artistic flair, blending brutality with dark humor and visual panache. Scenes like the massacre at the wedding or the brutal killing of Sardar Khan are not just acts of violence but cinematic set pieces, combining raw brutality with a grim, almost operatic sense of drama. The film's ability to mix humor with horror in its depiction of violence sets it apart.
उसके लौंडे रात दिन वहां जुआ खेलते हैं, शराब पीते हैं, लौंडिया उठा के लाते हैं रात को। क्या करें आप?
The portrayal of violence in Indian films often mirrors societal issues. During periods of political unrest, societal upheaval, and economic disparity, films have depicted the resultant violence with the help of their stories and, of course, the chaos that happens because of all these events. For instance, the gritty realism of Gangs of Wasipur reflects the lawlessness and power struggles in northern and eastern India, providing a cinematic lens through which the audience can engage with these harsh realities. Similarly, Asuran depicts caste based violence, mirroring societal tensions which are prevalent in rural Tamil Nadu. Now, the Central Board of Film Certification, CBFC, has played a crucial and often dictatorial role in regulating the violent content in Indian films. Over the years, the organization has oscillated between strict censorship and more liberal stances reflecting changing societal norms. Public reactions to violent films has also evolved. While earlier films faced backlash and call for bans, contemporary audiences are more accepting of violence as a narrative device because they understand why the violence is being used and they appreciate the artistic and thematic reasons behind the use of violence. Now, today we have a dichotomy in Indian cinema when it comes to the portrayal of violence. We have stylistic violence and we have raw nature of violence. Films like Animal epitomize stylistic violence, presenting it with a certain aesthetic and making it almost a visual spectacle. This style often involves elaborate fight sequences, slow motion shots, upbeat background music, and a heightened sense of drama. For instance, the trailer of Animal hints at a blood soaked saga of vengeance where violence is depicted with grandiosity, making it as much a part of the visual narrative as the story itself. But in Badlapur, the scenes where Raghu exacts her revenge are crafted with meticulous detail, using lighting and sound to enhance the impact of each violence in every scene that is shown in the film. Especially the climax where Raghu confronts his enemy in a grungy house, both it's a both psychological and a physical battle that is portrayed with stylistic intensity that lingers with the audience even after the film is done and the credits start rolling. On the other hand, the raw portrayal of violence is seen prominently in South Indian cinema. Films like Jailer and Leo do not shy away from depicting gore and brutality in their most unrefined form. The violence in these films is often graphic and shocking, aimed at creating a visceral impact. In Jailer, Rajnikant's character beheads a goon out of nowhere, showcasing unflinching realism. In Asuran, the scene where Dhanush's character ruthlessly slaughters the men who attacks his family is portrayed with unflinching realism, intended to evoke a strong emotional response, highlighting the brutal realities of caste and social injustice. Similarly, Leo features sequences where the protagonist takes a gang of criminals with unrelenting ferocity. The blood soaked battles become a central part of the film's narrative, showcasing the protagonist's descent into relentless violence. Now, coming back to films like Animal, they have received criticism for glamorizing violence, potentially influencing impressionable viewers to normalize such behaviors in real life. Critics also point out that the graphic depictions of violence can overshadow the narrative, reducing complex stories to mere spectacles of brutality. The debate often revolves around whether the violence serves as a narrative in like it does it serve the purpose of the narrative, or is it just a tool to attract audiences so that you can shock them and give them a thrilling experience in the theaters. In the climax of Animal, a blood-soaked Ranbir Kapoor look-alike slaughters someone, drawing cheers from the audience. Similarly, in Vikram, we have Surya's shocking cameo as Rolex beheading someone, which turned the theater into a stadium. What does this say about the viewers? Is this gripping story, or the unexpected role of a star, or a mix of both that gets the cheering in the theaters? Scenes from films like NH10 and Asuran, while powerful and contextually justified, have sparked discussions about the need for stricter content guidelines and the potential psychological effects on viewers. The portrayal of violence must be handled with care, ensuring that it does not cross into justified celebration and that its presence is justified within the story's moral and thematic framework. The violence on the screen should not turn into torture porn. Now, when violence is used thoughtfully, it can enhance the narrative and add depth to the characters and their motivations. For example, in Badlapur, again coming back to Badlapur, the protagonist's journey of vengeance is depicted with a stylistic intensity that emphasizes his psychological transformations and the moral ambiguity of revenge that he is seeking. This careful and thoughtful integration of violence into the story ensures that it serves a greater purpose, making the film more impactful and thought provoking. Ultimately, the intent behind the depiction of violence and its relevance to the narrative are the key factors in determining how effective the violence is and how ethically acceptable can it be when it comes to the realm of cinema. Now, of course, different directors have different approaches of depicting violence. Rohit Shetty's films stylize action sequences that are more about the spectacle than the realism. In contrast, Anurag Kashyap's approach is grounded in raw brutality with scenes that are often uncomfortable to watch because of how intensely real they are. This variation in directorial styles showcases the diverse ways that violence can be utilized to enhance storytelling. Once again, coming to Badlapur, Sriram Raghavan's nuanced portrayal of violence, such as the chilling scene where Varun Dhawan's character exacts revenge in cold and methodical manner, highlights the psychological depth of his approach. Advances in special effects and makeup have also revolutionized the depiction of gore in Indian cinema. Earlier films relied heavily on rudimentary techniques to suggest blood and injuries. Modern films employ sophisticated prosthetics, digital effects, and realistic blood squibs to create convincing scenes of violence. This technological progress allows filmmakers to push the boundaries of what can be shown on screen, adding a visceral impact to all the violent sequences. The realistic gore in Animal, with its detailed makeup and special effects, exemplifies this advancement. The aspect of sound when it comes to violence also plays a crucial role in amplifying the impact. Sound design can heighten the sense of realism, with bone crunching hits, gunshots, and screams adding to the immersive experience. Music also contributes significantly. Tense, fast paced scores can build suspense, while sudden silence can shock the audience and emphasize the brutality of a scene. The use of sound in NH10, especially during the harrowing chase scenes, creates an atmosphere of tension and fear. Now, filmmakers often grapple with the balance between the artistic freedom and the social responsibility when it comes to depicting violence. While directors and writers seek to push the creative boundaries and tell compelling stories, they must also consider the potential societal impact of their work. The depiction of extreme violence raises questions about the glorification versus condemnation and the ethical responsibility of not inciting real world harm. Cinema might be about storytelling. Of course, it is about storytelling. But in our movie obsessed nation, we know the power that cinema has to shape the minds of the audiences. The impact of violent films on young audiences has been a topic of debate. Critics argue that exposure to graphic violence can desensitize viewers and potentially incite real world aggression. However, others believe that these films can serve as a form of catharsis, allowing viewers to confront and process societal issues in a controlled environment. Studies on the psychological impact of violent media have shown mixed results, highlighting the complexity of this issue. Psychological studies offer varied perspectives, suggesting that the impact of violent media depends on individual viewers' backgrounds and mental states and context. In the grand scheme of Indian cinema, the perspective and voices of women often get downed or dismissed as inconsequential, especially when catering to a predominantly male audience. Even when male directors attempt to highlight societal issues through the depictions of sexual abuse or violence against women, the portrayal can inadvertently sustain sadistic desires or desensitize the viewers to these heinous acts. Although these outcomes are not intentional, One effective way to mitigate them is by involving more women in the filmmaking process. For example, we have Meera Nayar's Monsoon Wedding and Anvita Dutt's Bulbul, which stand as prime examples of sensitively portraying the trauma of sexual violence survivors without glorifying the violence itself. It underscores the necessity of centering women's voices and perspectives when depicting such scenes. After all, the ultimate aim of these filmmakers is to spotlight and challenge the very violence they depict. As Indian cinema continues to push the envelope, the blood on the screen is not just a spectacle, it's a mirror reflecting the raw, unfiltered reality of our society's darkest corners, daring us to confront what lies beneath the surface. What lies beneath the surface? Filmmakers must balance the artistic and narrative aspects of violence, ensuring that it enhances the story rather than overshadowing it. They have to navigate this uncharted territory where art imitates life and life imitates art, forcing us to face our deepest truths. The recent example of the movie Kill highlights this ongoing evolution, demonstrating how violence has become a crucial element in contemporary Indian cinema. The recent release Kill rewrites the rulebook on violence in Indian cinema, offering a visceral and meticulously crafted rhythm of brutality that propels the narrative forward. The action is not mindless, it is mindfully spaced, weaving its own tale. The characters of trained commandos and the band of dacoits have distinct style of action. One is trained with moves that become increasingly dangerous as time passes, while the other is raw yet methodical in their madness. In the end, both become absolute killing machines in a battle of the last man standing. By the interval, all hell breaks loose in what might be the bloodiest and the most dramatic title reveal in recent memory. When Amrit, played by Lakshya, smashes a head with a fire extinguisher, it is not just for shock value but to underline the personal stakes. As a breathless, violent action film, Kill delivers without the crutches of Bollywood cliches, making us believe that a new era of the action violence genre is on the horizon in the country.